Hey, welcome back to my videos. Today we are going to be reading and discussing Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. It's a long story, so I'm going to go ahead and get into it. I will be reading the story and pausing to talk about important themes and sort of just to ruminate over what we have just read. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below, or if you're one of my students, text me, I'll remind. All right, let's get into it. The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. First thing we're going to take note of is this was written in 1948, which is important to remember as we get into this because several things are quite different from how it is today. But let's start reading with the first paragraph. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, there are only about 300 people. So the lottery took less than 2 hours. So it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the roundest and smoothest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the village pronounced his name Delacroix, eventually made a pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of other boys. The girls stood aside, talking amongst themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers and sisters. So let's just sort of pausing for a second. So something strange is going on, though, if they are gathering stones. What kind of lottery is this? Because we do know a lottery is going on. They mention it, and also the title. But why are they gathering stones? That is definitely something peculiar. To continue on, I'm on the third paragraph now. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planning and rain and tractors and taxes. They stood together, away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon, the women, standing by their husbands, began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and oldest brother. So, pausing again from the story, this is very much, if you've ever been to something like a church potluck or a family reunion, they're following very similar social structures, where the children are playing, the men gather, The women are always the last ones there because they've been preparing things. So, what we're supposed to take from this and from what Shirley Jackson has shown us is just how normal this is. All right, so this is paragraph 4. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teen club, and the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had the time and energy to devote to such civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square, carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between them and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was a hesitation before 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool, while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside of it. So, I want to point one more thing out. I'm sorry. But we can see Mr. Summers, the man that's conducting it, he conducts all the little things they do in town, like the square dances, the Halloween program. And once again, this is Shirley Jackson just telling us this is as normal as it could be. All right, so 5th paragraph. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box, now resting on the stool, had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. So no one wants to interfere with this tradition that has been going on. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, and the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year, after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stained. All right, next paragraph. Mr. Martin and his oldest son Baxter held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny, but now the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing. It was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up slips of paper and put them in the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square the next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves' barn, and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was on a shelf in the Martin grocery and left there. consider, since we're still thinking about what kind of lottery is this, it might be significant that nobody wants to think about it after it's done. Maybe. Something to consider. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were lists to make up of heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household in each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmasters as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered, there had been a recital of some sort, performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believed that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people, but years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed with time. Until now, it was felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at all of this, in his clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting carelessly on the black box. He seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. So, let's keep in our heads, a little back in our heads, that parts of the lottery have been allowed to change over the years, that Mr. Graves used to, or the officiant of the lottery, used to sing a song, but now they've decided to let that go. So, let's just remember as we're going forward that some parts of the lottery have been allowed to be discontinued. Just might be something significant we want to remember later on. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders, and slid into place in the back of the crowd. "Clean forgot what day it was," she said to Mrs. Delacoy, who sat next to her, and they both laughed softly. "Thought my old man was out back stacking wood," Miss Hutchinson went on. "And then I looked out the window and the kids was gone, and I remembered it was the 27th and came a-running." She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacoy said, "You're in time, though. They're still talking away up there." Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd, and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacoy on the arm as a farewell, and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson," and "Bill, she made it after all." Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning, "Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink, now would you, Joe?" And a soft laughter ran through the crowd as people stirred back into position after Miss Hutchinson's arrival. So this is paragraph 10 now. "Well now," Mr. Summers said somberly, "guess we better get started, get this over with, so's we can all get back to work. Anybody ain't here?" "Dunbar," several people said. "Dunbar, Dunbar." Mr. Summers consulted his list. "Clyde Dunbar," he said. "That's right. He's broken his leg, hasn't he?" Who's drawing for him? Me, I guess, a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. Wife draws for her husband, Mr. Summers said. Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie? Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. Horace is not but 16 yet, Miss Dunbar said regretfully. Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year. Paragraph 15. Right, Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, Watson boy drawing this year? A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. Here, he said. I'm drawing for my mother and me. He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, Good fellow, Jack, and Glad to see your mother's got a man to do it. Well, Mr. Summers said, guess that's everybody. Old man Warner make it? Here, a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell over the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at his list. All ready? He called. Now, I'll read the names. Head of families first, and the men come up and take the paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hands without looking at it until everyone has a turn. Everything clear? So one thing we can see and that we should notice as readers is how much of a ritual this is that everyone in the town participates in. Even though it's been going on for so long, no one really seems to remember much about it. But we're going to be starting with paragraph 20 now. The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, Adams? A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. Hi, Steve, Mr. Summers said. And Mr. Adams said, Hi, Joe. They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went back hastily to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. Allen, Mr. Summers said. Anderson? Bentham? Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore, Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. Seems like we got through the last one only last week. Time sure goes fast, Mrs. Graves said. Clark, Delacroix, paragraph 25. There goes my old man, Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went forward. Dunbar, Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box, while one of the women said, Go on, Janie, and another said, There she goes. We're next, Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd, there were men holding the small, folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. Harbert, Hutchinson, get up there, Bill, Miss Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. Paragraph 30. Jones? They do say, Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, that over in the North Village they're talking about giving up the lottery. Old Man Warner snorted. Pack of crazy fools, he said. Listening to the young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery, he added petulantly. Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody. Some places have already quit lotteries, Mrs. Adams said. Nothing but trouble in that, Old Man Warner said stoutly. Pack of young fools. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second there. Y'all can tell I like reading Old Man Warner's part. And I'm sorry I'm getting so southern in this. But, so what we should notice from Old Man Warner's lines, that, lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. So, that seems to be saying that they believe, or at one time they believe, if you have a lottery in June, that's going to make your harvest better. You'll be able to grow more corn. And he is complaining that the young people have forgotten that. And so, the way, people will complain about young people now, that they don't want to follow the old rituals and do things a new way, and that will lead to disaster. Okay, but let's go back to reading. So we are on paragraph 35. Martin and Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. Overdyke, Percy. I wish they'd hurry, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. I wish they'd hurry. They're almost through, her son said. You get ready to run and tell Dad, Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called out his own name and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, Warner? 77th year I've been in the lottery, Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd. 77th time. Watson. The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, Don't be nervous, Jack. And Mr. Summers said, Take your time, son. Zanini? After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding the slip of paper in the air, said, All right, fellows. For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were open. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons? The voices began to say, It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it. Go tell your father, Mrs. Dunbar said to the older son. So we're on paragraph 45 now. We can see the Watsons, or not the Watsons, the Hutchinsons have been selected for the lottery. So paragraph 45. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, You didn't give him enough time to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair. Be a good sport, Tessie, Mrs. Delacoy called, and Mrs. Graves said, All of us took the same chance. Shut up, Tessie, Bill Hutchinson said. Well, everyone, Mr. Summers said, that was done pretty fast, and now we got to be hurrying a little more to get it done in time. He consulted his next list. Bill, he said, you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons? There's Don and Eva, Mrs. Hutchinson shouted. Make them take their chance. Paragraph 50. I'm going to pause here again and say, notice the way that Tessie, Mrs. Hutchinson, is behaving. Note, she was joking before this all started. But now she's saying that it wasn't fair, they didn't pick right, and she wants other people to be involved in this lottery. So she's trying to say, there's Dawn and Eva, Eva being her daughter. Make her come up and draw with us. So, paragraph 50. Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie, Mr. Summers said gently. You know that as well as anyone else. It wasn't fair, Tessie said. I guess not, Joe, Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair, and I've got no other family except the kids. Then, as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you, Mr. Summers said in an explanation. As far as drawing for other households is concerned, that's you too, right? Right, Bill Hutchinson said. Paragraph 55. How many kids, Bill? Mr. Summers asked formally. 3, Bill Hutchinson said. There's Bill Jr., Nancy and little Dave, and Tessie and me. All right, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you got their tickets back? Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. Put them in the box then, Mr. Summers directed. Take Bill's and put it in. I think we ought to start over, Mrs. Hutchinson said, as quietly as she could. I tell you, it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to choose. Everybody saw that. Paragraph 60. Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box, and when he dropped all the papers but those on the ground, where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. Listen, everybody, Miss Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. Ready, Bill? Mr. Summers asked. And Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. Remember, Mr. Summers said, take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave. Mr. Graves took the hands of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. Take a paper out of the box, Davy, Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. Take just one paper, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you hold it for him. Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight little fist and held it while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. Nancy next, Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. Bill Jr., Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, nearly knocked the box over as he got a paper out. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her. Paragraph 65. Bill, Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out, at last with the slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, I hope it's not Nancy. And the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. It's not the way it used to be, Old Man Warner said clearly. People ain't the way they used to be. Which is a line that we will discuss later, so remember it. All right, Mr. Summers said. Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's. Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs up at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding up their slips of paper above their heads. So, let's keep in mind they're celebrating that all of them have gotten blank papers, that they haven't gotten a mark. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. It's Tessie, Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. Show us her paper, Bill. Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it. The black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with a heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. All right, folks, Mr. Summers said. Let's finish it quickly. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and had lost the original black box, they still remembered how to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacoy selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both of her hands and turn to Mrs. Dunbar. Come on, she said. Hurry up. Paragraph 75. Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both her hands, and she said, gasping for breath, I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you. The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of the cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. It isn't fair, she said. A stone hit her in the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, Come on, come on, come on, everyone. Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers, with Mrs. Graves beside him. It isn't fair! It isn't right! Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. Which is the end of the story. So, guys, they stoned Tessie Hutchinson. She won the lottery, and the lottery prize was being stoned. So why did they do this? Now, we know from the beginning of the story, or the middle-ish, where Old Man Warner says there used to be a saying, lottery in June, corn heavy soon, which would imply that when the lottery originally started, they thought that by doing the lottery, it would cause their crops to be more bountiful, more plentiful. And so, in theory, that is why the lottery began. However, like I told you to remember that important line, people aren't the same now. Everything is different now. And so, even though they've been able to change the box, change everything, they still remember to stone people. So, is it fair? Should it go on? So, this story is supposed to be taking place in 1948. And if you are in my class, or in Mr. Robertson's or Mrs. Cole's class, you have 2 other articles that talk about human sacrifice and how there is a history of it in the modern world. I think I might be doing another video to talk about synthesizing all this information together, but I think you have a lot to go on to move forward. All right, thank y'all for watching. Bye. Oh, like, subscribe, do all those things. Bye.